Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope everyone's doing okay and staying safe. Today we're talking about the second part of Chapter 18, Renaissance and Baroque, Part 2. I wanted to show you first, this is the rest of the semester timeline that I had updated for the move to remote learning. We are right here, Friday, April 10th, movie review 2 due, depending on when you watch this. There's no class Friday, April 10th. There's no class Monday, April 13th because of Easter break. This is part 2 of the Renaissance through Baroque, Wednesday, April 15th. All hands-on projects are also due on Schoology, so make sure you upload a fairly clear photograph of all of your hands-on projects. If you click on the section that says hands-on projects, you will notice there's a couple of media albums there where you can upload your images. You can even title them. So for instance, for the photo scavenger hunt, you could put in the comments or put in the title itself what prompted that particular photograph for your scavenger hunt. And then keep up with the art themes as well. We have the second response due Friday, April 17th. That will be on Schoology. Then the week after this, we're moving into the 18th and 19th century, modern and contemporary art. And then week 16, 2 weeks from now, depending on when you're watching this, we're going to have a review for the final and then a final exam. Of course, you also have your second exhibition review. I updated that so that it reflects the fact that you can't go to a gallery right now, which is really a difficult time for artists if you think about it. A lot of artists plan their exhibition for over the course of like a year or 2 years, and they're working on their stuff in their studio. They go to mount this exhibition in a gallery, and boom, all the galleries are closed right now. So this is a really difficult thing. So I know a lot of my friends, a lot of my peers, a lot of other artists right now have these big exhibitions in museums and galleries, and no one can go. It's like they're holding up their phone and they're saying, hey, check out my exhibition that nobody can go to. So that said, what I'm going to have you do is something a little bit more clever and unique, and that is write about work that you can find online. So there's a couple of virtual exhibitions that I want you to explore, and you're going to pick the one that you relate to and identify with and write a 2 to 3 page paper about it. Similar to the way that we wrote the first exhibition review, but instead of seeing the work in person, you're seeing it remotely online. So I'm going to move to our talk today, the second part of Chapter 18, Renaissance and Baroque. I'm going to do it a little bit different order than what the book shows it. So the book starts the second half first with developments in Asia and Africa. I'm going to put that at the end because I think it makes a little bit more sense to work seamlessly from Renaissance through Baroque and Mannerism, and then sit and show kind of the overall context of other places, other locations. So one of the things about Mannerism is this is late Renaissance, and some artists, like for instance Michelangelo, lived a very long life. So his lifetime actually spans these two very different movements, the Renaissance and then later Mannerism. And I think the question would be, if Michelangelo is making art in his style, and who's commissioning him to do this? Well, it's the church, it's the Pope that's asking him to do all of these paintings and sculptures. Why would his art necessarily change in response? Well, the thing that happens is the Reformation. So you have Martin Luther in the beginning of the 16th century, who protests against the Catholic Church, against the selling of indulgences, among many other things. As a monk, he was copying the Bible and said, I think some of the things that the church is telling us, which really wasn't the Catholic Church at the time, it was just the church. He had these complaints, right? These gripes with the church. So as a result, we have the Reformation, and which kickstarts the Protestant church. In response to that, you have the Counter-Reformation. You have the Catholic Church itself, which was just the church at the time. The Pope that says we need to make a response and we need to reform the church ourselves. And so there were some philosophical and some dogma changes and different practices that happened. Well, this also affects the visual aspects of art made during this time as well. So an artist like Michelangelo, who early in his career made a sculpture like Pietà that we looked at before, that would have been considered vulgar and obscene and indecent because of the youth-like quality of Mary, but also it doesn't really do enough to kind of emphasize the supernatural quality, the spiritual, the metaphysical quality of Christ. It humanizes Christ. So Michelangelo, in his later work, really tries to show, as sanctioned by the Catholic Church, the more spiritual aspects. Instead of showing Christ as human-like, show him superhuman, show him larger than life. And so you see this shifting the artwork as well. So Mannerism is this response, this reaction to the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And we can see this philosophical split begin to happen between the Protestant and the Catholic Church. And then also in terms of the visual aspects, we see a lot more twisted and dynamic figures, elongated figures. We see this in Michelangelo. We see this in El Greco, which is one of the artists during the Mannerist period. And it's interesting because it's still very realistic and it's still showing off the artist's technique, but it's less rooted in naturalism. In other words, the figures get distorted and twisted and made to look like superhuman. This is Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Remember last time we looked at the Sistine Chapel, and a lot of times people think about the Sistine Chapel and they think about the ceiling. And yes, Michelangelo did the ceiling, and there are those 10 scenes from the Old Testament, including the God scene reaching out to Adam that I showed you that I have the tattoo of. But in the church, in this small private chapel of the Pope, there's also altar paintings on both sides. So it's a really narrow chapel, really tall ceiling. It's about the size of Brown Chapel, maybe just a little bit more narrow than Brown Chapel, but as long and as tall. There's kind of a comparison for you to think about the space itself. And so on these different altars, there are paintings by Botticelli and Giotto, earlier paintings that were in this space. But this was a commission by a different pope, so not Julius II, who commissioned the ceiling, and also Raphael's School of Athens, but a different pope, Pope Clement VII, who's really interested in showing a new kind of reality visually in his church, but also in his private chapel, but also throughout Italy as well, right, in the Papal States. So what we see here is later in Michelangelo's life. So if you think about at the time of Sistine Chapel painting the ceiling, that was 1508 to 1512. This is 20-some years later. It took a lot longer for him to finish this, and this is the scene of the Last Judgment. So here we see Christ at the center and making these judgments, right, in the Last Judgment, separating the good from the evil. There's a lot of nudity in this painting, which is interesting. A lot of people complained that at the time, one person said this is more fit for a bathhouse, right, or a tavern as opposed to a chapel, because there's just so much nudity, and nudity just for the sake of showing muscle and form. These figures are all really, really buff. Like even the women are really, really buff. It's interesting. There was a painter right after this was finished and after Michelangelo passed away that painted cloth covering the nudity in the fresco, the mural itself. They were considered, that was their job, that was their role, to kind of censor and clean up the artwork that they thought really wasn't fit. In a subsequent restoration, most of those cloths have been removed, but not all of them. We can still see them in certain spaces. There are some of the cloths that still remain, like this one here, but in other places they've been stripped back and removed, kind of more like what Michelangelo originally intended it. It's interesting because he's showing the kind of supernatural quality of the Last Judgment, right, as revealed in Revelations, that Christ will come back, and you can see the cross here a reference to columns and architecture that in a way, you know, these are the people that are building the kingdom of God. And where's the kingdom of God? It's in heaven. And how did that happen? It happened because of the sacrifice of Christ, that we can have redemption or salvation. And here you can see people literally either being thrown down And this is supposed to represent the idea of Hades here and crossing the river Styx, this ancient, reference, pagan reference to crossing into the afterlife. And they are either going to hell down here or they're going into heaven up here. What's interesting about this is this guy right here. If you can see this, hopefully I'm not covering this. This is one of the Pope's friends, and he was actually a kind of like a bishop in the church, and he complained as Michelangelo was literally painting this painting. He saw all the nudity, and he said to the Pope Clement VII, Michelangelo is just making a mockery of this chapel. He just needs to abandon it or change it so it's more religious, more fitting of a chapel painting. And the Pope actually backed Michelangelo, who was nicknamed the Divine One. They saw his creativity and his artistic genius as being God-granted. And the Pope said to this guy who was named Bassano, he said to him, my jurisdiction is over earth and heaven as the Pope, right? But not hell. So I can't tell Michelangelo what to paint in hell. So here Michelangelo depicts the guy that was complaining about his painting. And he has this serpent, this snake wrapped around his body, and the snake's head is biting his business, the man's junk right here in the center. It's just this awesome depiction of, hey, to the haters, Michelangelo is just this huge figure that can basically do what he wants to do. It's also interesting how in this, sorry, I keep accidentally bumping the wrong button here. This is see this representation right here? This is actually, it's a double portrait, just like Raphael's School of Athens. Not only is this is supposed to be St. Bartholomew, who had his skin flayed, but it's also a self-portrait. Michelangelo depicts himself as this kind of martyred figure, but he sees himself really close to God here. It's kind of like Christ's right-hand man, and you see Madonna here. It's really, really close, but yet he's sort of like, he kind of mocks himself by putting him close, but also mocks himself in this kind of self-deprecating way of being this cast-off figure. So a really interesting depiction and a lot of symbolism here. Why is this mannerism? Well, we see twisted figures. We see a lot more movement and drama and larger-than-life figures to show the supernatural qualities as opposed to the lifelike qualities, the realistic or the naturalistic qualities of the Renaissance. Another artist that is during this period of mannerism is El Greco. And El Greco, that's a nickname. It means the Greek one. And he was born in Greece and then trained in Florence and Venice in Italy, and then later moved to Toledo, Spain, and worked as an artist there for the court, for the royal court. So he did a lot of paintings for the king and for counts. And this is a really interesting painting because it's just very typical and penultimate sort of mannerism. We see long, stretched out figures. Here we see Christ. Here we see Christ twice here, and we see the Virgin Mary here. Look at how elongated the figures are. And we see St. Peter. How do we know this is St. Peter? St. Peter is always shown with keys, the keys to heaven, right? St. Peter is opening the gates and the founding of the church. So Spain was part of, even though in the north you had Protestant faith later, Spain was still part of the Catholic Church attached to the Pope in Italy. And this is a really interesting painting because it shows us a couple of different viewpoints. That's what I want you to remember about this painting, is when we walk into this, and what the painting doesn't show you is right below this is actually the tomb where Count Orgaz is buried. So there's the actual tomb is there, and this painting is a fresco above it. And so it has this space. When we walk in, we're sort of like eye level with this, and we can see the burial. We can see this count who's being lowered into his grave. So that's kind of one perspective. But then there's also the second perspective of looking up and this kind of celestial representation of heaven here as being very supernatural, very exaggerated and spiritual, and meant to not be necessarily something that we would expect to see, but more like almost like cartoony and exaggerated. The figures are really, really tall, stretched out, and elongated to make them look supernatural, spiritual, and larger than life, as the church at the time would have wanted them to do. You can't make Christ look like any ordinary person because he's not an ordinary person. And what's interesting about this too is this painting was made about 200 years after Count Orgaz had died, and it was made to commemorate him. But these people here are actually contemporaries of El Greco and the court at the time. So it shows us a couple of different time periods, looking back, looking forward, and present day. So it's a very contemporary painting and really interesting use of mannerism. The next major movement that happens after the Renaissance is called Baroque. And Baroque style is really known for its theatrical nature and how there's a lot of drama and movement and dynamic shapes and complex angles. One of the things that's really common in the Renaissance art is a lot of triangles and really posed compositions, or even thinking about the Mona Lisa, how you have the three-quarter view turned, right? Those were devices that were used over and over again. Well, Baroque wanted to shatter all of those contrived compositions. They wanted to make entirely new compositions. In a way, they were resistant to the Renaissance and really detested it. So they wanted it to change, and they took the best qualities of the Renaissance in terms of naturalism and emotion and light, but changed the composition so they're much more complex. There's a lot of like S-shaped compositions or dynamic angles, which we'll see in the work of Bernini and Caravaggio, but less kind of static, arranged, carefully made, like sort of triangles or crosses or squares in the composition, which we'll see. So a couple of things. Bernini, Caravaggio are the two major figures in the Baroque era, two artists that you should really know. And these ideas of the visual aspects and the theatrical nature of the work in terms of Baroque. So here we see St. Peter's Basilica. This is in Rome. It's actually separate from Rome. It's part of the Vatican. Actually, if you look over here, this is the Vatican Museum over here. And so this is St. Peter's. And if you walk in, this is the piazza, and Bernini added this piazza. If you walk into this space here, this is how you see St. Peter's, and Mass every month is held here with the Pope, and you know it can accommodate like 200,000 people in this piazza or this square. If you walk outside of here and walk all the way around, you can enter into the Vatican, and here's the Vatican Museum here, all these different buildings, and the Sistine Chapel is here's like the Pope's private apartment. The Sistine Chapel is about right here inside the Vatican Museum. All of these like buildings are attached and connected. So what is this piazza? Well, this is a space that was added. So this was originally designed, parts of this were designed by Michelangelo earlier, Maderno, and Bramante. And then later, Bernini added this piazza, and it has all of these saints. So these little tiny sculptures up here are all these different saints, and this colonnade, which means a row of columns. And in the center, he added these two fountains and this obelisk that was borrowed from Egyptian culture, right? And a great, mass of pilgrimage, making their pilgrimage to St. Peter's can gather in this space. So Bernini added this piazza with these colonnades, and it's meant to look like the church or Mother Mary of the church welcoming you, embracing you, hugging you. And this street right here is one of the world's largest streets. It's very, very massive. It can accommodate a lot of people, traffic walking up through Rome into visit St. Peter's. Because as you can imagine today, but also 500 years ago, lots of people have always traveled and want to go see St. Peter's. So I recommend you do this as well. If you have a chance to go to Rome, go to St. Peter's first. Generally do whatever the opposite of whatever the guidebooks tell you, because everyone's doing that, so do the opposite. But go to St. Peter's first, and you can gather here. You'll go through metal detectors here. You'll walk all the way up here, and you can go. A lot of people just walk right in and they can see inside of St. Peter's, which is amazing. You see views like this. But also, if you go to the right, you can climb up the steps to the top of the dome, and I have some amazing pictures. You can stop here and you can walk out, and these look small, but these are all the 12 apostles here and Christ depicted in these sculptures. You can look out over this space. These are stairways as well, and if you can kind of imagine, on the back side of this space right here, there's actually a gift shop where you can buy items that have been blessed by the Pope, which is pretty cool. And you can, which I've done before too, buy a postcard, fill it out to someone, and drop it off in the post office there, and they will send it out and it'll be stamped Vatican City. So you can climb all the way up to this lantern up here that was designed by Michelangelo, and you can look out over Bernini's Piazza. How does Bernini's Piazza speak to us in terms of Baroque art? Well, if we can imagine as being designed during the Renaissance, it probably would have been very symmetrical and right angles. Everything would have either been squares or triangles or circles. But here instead, we see a really interesting shape. It's a trapezoid. It's not parallel like this. It kind of moves in on itself. And then the arms aren't quite perfect circle either. They're an oval shape. So these are more complex shapes that represent the Baroque era. So it's this addition to this space that already existed. Bernini also, this isn't in the book, but this is a baldacchino, also known as a baldacchino. It is a canopy, and this is over the altar. This is the cross, where the transept and the narthex of the church in St. Peter's overlap. So this is inside St. Peter's. And actually, when you're about halfway up the dome, about right here, you can walk around the dome and you can look down on this space. And it is a couple hundred feet down, so people just look like teeny tiny little baby ants. What's interesting about this is, Bernini felt like, because of this grand scale of this space that had already been finished for over 100 years, he felt like the altar was really dwarfed. And because of the scale of the building, you lose, and this is actually right over top of where St. Peter is buried, his tomb that you can visit down below in the crypt. So this is a very special place. It has a very important place in the church, but also in terms of the religious structure of the church, the Catholic Church. So he places this baldacchino over top of the altar, and it's made of these twisted columns made of bronze that was actually recycled from ancient Roman sculptures that were inside of the Pantheon. So it's kind of like a little bit of pirate robbery of who knows what these sculptures were. He reused them and melted them down to make this beautiful, larger than life. I mean, this thing is really, really tall and beautiful to see in person, and just any quality, of when you walk into St. Peter's, it's just overwhelming. At the time, largest church in the world, still one of the biggest. The quality of light pouring in, gold, all the different sculptures that are around, it's just so awe-inspiring. Michelangelo's Pietà is in this space as well, right when you walk in. So just an amazing place to visit and kind of reflect on the aspects of the Catholic Church and these different figures who have impacted history. Bernini also made, in addition to architecture, he made standalone sculptures, and here we see a very famous sculpture by Bernini, one of my favorite sculptures of all time, and it's called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. St. Teresa was an actual person. She was a nun who had these sort of mystical writings, and she described her experiences. And she became a saint. So in the tradition of the Catholic Church, after you die, if you performed a miracle and had impacted people's lives, then you could become a canon, part of the canon of saints. She becomes a saint. And so Bernini makes this sculpture dedicated to Saint Teresa here in the private chapel of the Cornaro family in this beautiful church called the Santa Maria della Vittoria. And so when you have this large church, a lot of times the church itself is usually built by a certain person. In this case, it was made during a royal period where someone built this, and then the chapels themselves are, if you kind of think of a chapel today, we think of like a building itself. But in this case, the chapels were these small rooms that come off of the main space in the church. So you have all these smaller chapels that were generally paid for by private families. And then once you had this, you wanted to have a reason for people to come and to pray and would not necessarily disturb the normal service that was going on, church service, or even as pilgrims came through and kind of walked through and doing their religious pilgrimage, they can stop and see all of these different artworks that's in the chapel. And a lot of times people will be buried in their chapels as well. So that's kind of the context for this. So imagine a space about 10 foot by 15 foot, and that's the chapel inside of this main church. And this was a really, really special one, and this is a very wealthy family. So they commissioned Bernini to make this space. And what's interesting about is Bernini, not only was he an architect, but he also was interested in theater and stage and design. And so this sculpture becomes like a stage set. If you look in the book on page 465, it shows the sculpture, but off to the side, and it has this overall context as well, where you can see these gilded wood framed pieces of like the sun, that's the rays of light that are coming in. He's not just thinking about the sculptures themselves, but the context, the space, like this cloud, this rock-like cloud that St. Teresa is floating on. And you have the angel here, but also the space to the right is this low relief with these sculptures kind of looking out as if they're in a box, like a balcony box in a theater watching this action. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition. In a sense, it's like really a precursor to modern day installation art or really site-specific work. So a couple of things about Teresa. Who was Saint Teresa? Well, she was a nun who had these mystical writings, and she had this experience. She had these visions after her father had died, and one of the visions that she had was she had this experience or this vision where an angel came and pierced her in her side with an arrow. And she said that the pain was so great, I screamed aloud, she wrote. But at the same time, I felt such infinite sweetness that I wished the pain to last forever. So not just this arrow was piercing her, she was feeling the pain and love of Christ entering into her, piercing her, physically affecting her. So interesting vision, really interesting writing. How does Bernini visually represent this? Well, he shows that ecstasy of St. Teresa, this like pain and pleasure at the same time, as this arrow is piercing into her, right? And this angel looks like way too happy to be doing this, of course. But it's interesting, a contemporary, what do you see when you look at this, right? Look at her face. Look at her body. Look at her hand, her foot. I didn't make this stuff, you guys. Bernini. It's a little bit vulgar, right? And even a critic at the time said, this is vulgar. Like, this is showing a female orgasm in a church. Like, what? Like, look at her mouth. She's even curling her toe of her foot. So it's this way of showing this mystical, spiritual experience as a sensual or a sexual experience. And this is in a church, y'all. This is crazy. So I tried to see this sculpture through 3 different times and struck out. Finally got to see it on the last attempt. One time the church was closed, another time it was under renovation. It said, if you look closely, you can peek behind the tarp and you can see the sculpture. I looked at the tarp, you couldn't see anything. I mean, it was just all blocked by scaffolding and just all this equipment that was working on it. So this last time when I brought students to Italy, I finally got a chance to see it in person. You can see, here's the chapel. This is an altar, so you can kind of bow down here at the altar and kind of kneel here, and you can look up at the ecstasy of St. Teresa. Well, we took students and we were there for a while. Remember, this is something I tried to see a couple of different times. So for me, it was just one of those things. I've taught about this for a long time, and this has been a really important sculpture to me. I thought it was a really interesting piece, very beautiful. I love Bernini's work, the movement, the dynamic angles, and just the story, the narrative that's there. So students all came and looked at this, and they were walking around. There's a lot to see in the church, and I thought everybody was gone. And I'm staring at this thing. I'm transfixed. Like, I am just like mesmerized by this sculpture. It's so beautiful. If you look close, I mean, it looks. Michelangelo was great, but Bernini, in a way, tried to outdo and one-up him. If you look at the sense of like flesh, and he's able to make marble look like fabric and skin and stone. It's just amazing that he can transform a material like that. So I'm sitting and just looking and lost in the moment, and I teared up. I'm starting to cry, and I feel like nobody else is around and looking, and I look over, and this is Morgan Henson, Momo, if anyone knows Morgan. I look over, she's still there, she's sitting, and she's tearing up too. So it was a really powerful moment for me, and one of those things that art really can impact you. And I personally feel like myself, and I say this a lot, that a life that's dedicated to art is a life worth living. It gives meaning to life. It gives joy, and it brings you a certain sort of overall kind of context. Like, you can stand in the same place that Bernini was like 400 years ago. It's just amazing to think about this kind of connection. So another sculpture Bernini made was a depiction of David. Remember, David is seen as this heroic figure. We have examples by Michelangelo and also by Donatello. Remember those two pieces? And those were meant as representative symbolism of Florence. This was commissioned later by a cardinal in Rome. So it doesn't have that connection to Florence anymore and that symbolism. And Bernini, and if you think about Baroque, right, in the Baroque period, it's all about theatrical. It's all about movement and drama and narrative. If you're thinking about the story, the biblical story of David, this one perhaps is a lot more accurate to the story, because we see David mid-swing, like he's about to throw that rock with his slingshot to hit Goliath, right? It's not the before or the after, it's during. And actually, this is placed, I have some selfies with it. I spared you selfies, I didn't include more, but this is in Gallery Borghese, which is a pretty cool place in Rome. It's a private museum that was originally an estate, a house, a villa of one of the cardinals, Borghese. And he was friends with Bernini, and he commissioned him to make this, so that's why it's there. He was also friends with Caravaggio and bought some of his paintings. This cardinal, was really interested in telling the story of how David comes to represent the kingdom of God, and David as a king, but also God as a king. And so Rome, is in a way the center of kind of the world at the time, for trade, for goods, but also for power. So the cardinal wanted Bernini to show that aspect of power and strength and drama. We don't see the classical sort of contrapposto. We see so much. This is a freestanding sculpture, and actually where it's placed in Gallery Borghese, you have to walk across where David is looking, and you are crossing the path of where that stone is going to be thrown. So it's really brilliant where it's placed in the context of this space. And here I just want to show you in comparing it to Donatello's. Right? What are some of the aspects you think about Donatello's depiction of David? Well, symbolism of Florence, Platonic ideals, male nude. Here we see with Michelangelo, it's very, very classical. It's much more the manhood of David as opposed to the aspect of him being boy-like. And here with Bernini's, we see it's all about the action. Look at the biting of the lip, the furrowing of the brow. He's really intensely and intently, in this very fierce way, staring down his opponent, Goliath. He is not afraid, right? So it's really interesting, this drama. Also, I don't think the book mentions, oh, well, the book doesn't even show this, but one thing that's interesting to note is Bernini depicts himself as David. This is a self-portrait. It's really, really interesting to think about who the subject was. And there's a story of the Pope asking Bernini to make a sculpture of him, and Bernini said, who do you want it to look like besides yourself, right? Because you can imbue it with like classical traits or like contemporary traits. You can look like an emperor, you can look like another pope, and the Pope said, I want it to look like you. That's the status that he had. So Bernini was really this like affluent. He came from a rich family. He was interested in music and in art, and he became friends with the Pope. By contrast, Caravaggio, so if you think of these two big figures of the Baroque era, you have Bernini and you have Caravaggio. Caravaggio was really the bad boy of art and of the Baroque period. He wanted to depict what was actually happening in the streets. This is a very famous painting. This is called The Calling of St. Matthew, and this is also inside of a chapel in a larger church. So this is in the San Luigi dei Franceschi in Rome. So it was dedicated to the French ambassador living in Italy, this church. And this is the Cantarelli Chapel. So it's a chapel that has 3 paintings that are all dedicated to Matthew. And you have to, sit there in this small chapel as part of a larger church to see this painting. Beautiful painting, really impressive. I love seeing this in person. And it has this great quality of light to it, right? So you see this light that is moving across the composition. Remember, Renaissance compositions, triangles, squares. Well, with Baroque, we see much more dynamic angles, right? Atypical perspectives, this dramatic light that comes in from the right across from the left. How does this represent a street scene? Well, this is interesting. It's the calling of St. Matthew, where Matthew was a tax collector, right? And Jesus says, now you're going to be one of my disciples. You're going to be one of the apostles. I want you to come with me. And he's in a tavern. He's in a bar. They're playing games. They're like gambling here. This is like a bawdy scene. This is like kind of sacrilegious. I mean, you wouldn't think of this as a religious depiction in a chapel of a way of showing someone who is a saint, St. Matthew here. Look at this part right here. You see this? This is Christ. And the only way that this tells us that this is even a spiritual painting or religious painting is that subtle halo. Do you see that right there? Over Christ's head. These 2 figures are walking in barefoot because they are holy. They're walking on hallowed ground, and they're about to turn Matthew into the disciple or apostle, right? Say, follow me. Do you notice this? That resembles something to you, right? That's the same pose that Michelangelo did in the Sistine Chapel of God reaching out and Adam, reaching out in exchange, kind of that kind of pose. It's really interesting. He borrows that, right? So this angle. Caravaggio, like I said, was the bad boy. He was not born into riches. He was not favored by the Catholic Church. He did a lot of commissions, but he kind of fell out of favor. He got into a lot of street brawls, fights. He killed someone. This is likely one of the only artists in all of our history that was convicted of murder. He killed someone in a sword fight. He got into a fight. I mentioned this earlier when we talked about Caravaggio, and he was on the run. He left Italy. He was on the island of Malta, and he got sick, and the Pope actually pardoned him, and he was on his way back to Italy when he died. He died very, very young. But, his work was very, very popular at the time. But then it fell out of favor. And for a long time, up until the late 19th century, early 20th century, people really didn't talk about Caravaggio. It's kind of interesting how someone can be really important and pivotal at the time, to the point where people, even followed him, which we know, like Gentileschi, who we've talked about before, was a Caravaggisti, and she was a follower of Caravaggio. One of the vocab words is tenebrism, which is a very exaggerated sense of chiaroscuro. So tenebrism means large areas of darkness to reveal the scene, to reveal the brightness. And this is the conversion of Saul into St. Paul. He has kind of his hands outstretched almost in this Christ-like manner here. He becomes blinded and he falls off of his horse here. Just very beautiful, but a really dynamic angle. They would have never done this in the Renaissance. Really interesting, dynamic compositional structure here. Very theatrical. Another sense of Caravaggio's drama. And it's interesting here, remember, Bernini depicts himself as David, right? Well, this is young David beheading Caravaggio, or I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm good. I think I'm good now. So here we see Caravaggio's depiction of David beheading Goliath. And remember, Bernini depicted himself as David. Well, here, Caravaggio depicts himself as Goliath. So even he sees himself as this kind of bad boy figure. And he doesn't identify with the protagonist or who becomes king, but rather he depicts himself. Oh, thank you. My wife just delivered me. She heard I was a little of a clump there and I was a little choked up, so she brought me some water. Thank you, Carly. I appreciate it. Get you a wife that treats you that good, so I appreciate it. I need to take a breath. I know I'm talking too fast. I get really excited about this stuff, y'all. I love art. I love art history. I love Italian stuff. So here we see Caravaggio depicts himself as Goliath, as the antagonist instead of the protagonist. It's really interesting. He sees himself as the bad boy as well. We talked about Caravaggisti before. Those are painters who follow in Caravaggio's footsteps. We talked about Gentileschi before. Remember Judith beheading and killing Holofernes. We also saw Gentileschi as the allegory of painting, the muse of painting. How do I remember all these names? These are just, I love art history and I really study. I think the more you look, the more you identify with these works and just kind of think about them. Gentileschi and make the connection. Oh, Gentileschi, where did I hear that name before? That's right, Judith and Holofernes. Or, the paint allegory as the muse of painting. That's why I put on our test visual identification, because I think one of the things that's really important as you talk about art and as you study art is this sort of like groundwork, this overall vocabulary context that you can identify certain key artists and artworks so that you become a little bit more knowledgeable and have a framework to, say, compare a Gentileschi to a painting by Rembrandt, or to compare Gentileschi to the painting to the work of Raphael, or even her father, who was also a painter, and so that you can become a lot more knowledgeable about these things. And I don't expect you to necessarily go on Jeopardy and answer all the art history questions, but one thing that I think is really applicable to this, no matter what your major or your field of study ends up being, one of these things that really connects us as humans is art. And if you think about right now during this pandemic, what's going on? What are people turning to? They're turning to movies, right? They're turning to Netflix, to entertainment. They're looking at Instagram, right? And they're seeing visual depictions and design and artists. It's like in tough times, who do people turn to tell our stories or to connect us? And I think it's artists. So I think it's a really applicable skill that you can use even if you're going into business or becoming a doctor. Like, it's one conversation that can always kind of connect us is this idea of art and the value of art and how to appreciate it, how to understand it, how to discuss it. So that if nothing else, when you go through a museum, you can, maybe don't identify every single piece, but you can recognize Baroque, or you can recognize Mannerism or Impressionism or Post-Impressionism, and you can kind of give this like influenced tour of information based on a framework before you even look at the title, right? So that's kind of my hope. So here we see a work by Gentileschi, who was influenced by Caravaggio. Another artist that was influenced by Caravaggio is Rembrandt, and this is his painting The Resurrection of Christ. It's influenced by Caravaggio because we see tenebrism, a lot of dark areas, then this angel in the center showing the resurrection. So if you kind of think about the way Caravaggio uses tenebrism, uses the quality of light coming in, we see that as well in the major works of Rembrandt. a lot of really, really dark pieces, but then the key focus, the emphasis is in these areas of light. So here, even though the depiction is the resurrection of Christ, it's like, wait a minute, but where is Christ? Because you see, if you look at this, and even though it's like really, really dramatic, there's a lot going on, and you kind of have to tease out the detail. Well, you see the, like the Roman soldiers here who would have been responsible for guarding the tomb. You see people grieving the loss of Christ. And it's interesting, the depiction where we actually see Christ possibly resurrected here with this kind of beam of light on him, and not in the tomb down below here where his followers go to check on him, right? So it's a really interesting depiction here. Rembrandt, we know, was a follower of Caravaggio, but he didn't see, and he was in the north, so this is Baroque in Northern Europe. So Rembrandt's a Dutch artist. Rembrandt was influenced by Caravaggio, but he didn't know Caravaggio. He didn't see Caravaggio's work, but he studied with artists that had seen Caravaggio's work. So Caravaggio's work was important to them. They copied it, and then Rembrandt copied those techniques from those artists. So that's kind of how we get this passing down of Rembrandt learning from Caravaggio indirectly, but not directly. Caravaggio did a lot of scenes that made Christ connect to the people. And I showed you that Hunter Gilder's print when we were talking about the printmaking section that Rembrandt did. And that was a way that Rembrandt also connected Christ and religion and spirituality to the people. And he wanted to show it in the streets. He wanted to kind of show that rough, dirty grittiness and the plight of people that were living. One of the things that he focused on was Jews in Northern Europe who were kind of being persecuted even during the 17th century. So it's really interesting. And if you think about Rembrandt, a lot of times you think about self-portraits and landscapes, but he also did a lot of biblical studies as well. One of the last things in terms of the painting in the West is a move away from religious themes into more secular themes, especially in the North. This is a painting actually that I saw this summer at Yale when I was studying at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. This is something called the Pastoral. And Claude Lorrain, who we just simply called Claude now, he was a French painter, and he becomes very well known for making these very beautiful, poetic landscapes that are idyllic and meant to really show God's handiwork in nature, to the point of, well, there's some figures down here. I don't know if I'm blocking this part or not, but you see some figures down here, but mostly this is about the landscape. This becomes so typical right here. We call this a Claudian device. These trees here, it's always these three really kind of luscious green trees, and then this one on the left that kind of frames it. I've studied a lot of pastoral landscapes. British artists, a lot of French artists later, Impressionists, do this same exact thing where they put these three trees, and to the point where they actually lift them and copy and appropriate them right out of Claude Lorrain's paintings. And this device on the left, which actually helps frame the composition. But this becomes all about the landscape itself. So it's really interesting that a whole new kind of genre of art is created where landscape is now, instead of just being the background, it's the subject, which is really interesting and creates a whole new sort of genre of artwork. Just for overall context, I want to talk briefly a few images about what's going on at the same period in China, in Japan, and in Africa. So first, in China, during the medieval era, you have Mongols who came through and had taken over part of China. If you think about like Genghis Khan, his descendant Kublai Khan here, Marco Polo was, that famous game, like Marco Polo, he was a real person. Marco Polo was this like traveler, what's the word that I'm looking for? It's like someone that discovers, explorer, that's the word I was looking for. He's exploring. So he's exploring China, and he gets arrested when he worked in the administration for Kublai Khan. There was this kind of like seedy government that was working on taking over parts of China, this Mongol ruler that was taking over large areas of China. He comes back to Italy, he's arrested for his work, but he describes what China is like. and the beautiful paintings that there are, the extravagant art and architecture. So this was unknown for most of the people that lived in Europe, would have never seen China or experienced it. They would have just heard about it. So Marco Polo's depictions of China and his descriptions of them really form an impression of what China is like in this entire empire up through the 19th century. So it's really interesting. And during this time period, this era, we see this Chinese painting here during this Yuan dynasty, where the Mongolian Empire had invaded China and take over parts of it. So here we see that this artist is representing that. And this painting was done as protesting the theft of Chinese soil by these invaders, by the Mongol emperors, this conquest. And he's showing this orchid as being representative of China, but being left, the soil is in a way stolen, which is really interesting, and it's left out. So you show that the art can flourish even though what sustains it has been taken away. You can also see calligraphy at the side, which was, remember, calligraphy is the most important, and then next to that, ink painting was seen as the highest form, and landscape was seen as the highest form of art in this Chinese tradition. So this is what's happening kind of in the same era. This is moving during the same time as Renaissance is happening in Europe. This is the style of painting, and this is during the Ming Dynasty, after an emperor in China had kicked out and ousted those Mongol rulers, right? And they had taken back these provinces in China. And so it had this really peaceful reign afterwards. And so in this is a very decorative painting, but it's symbolic at the same time. This is a peacock and 100 other birds surrounding it, called Hundreds of Birds Admiring the Peacocks. Well, this peacock right here is meant to represent the emperor. And you can see the landscape. It's kind of like Lion King, right? Where he says to young Simba, like, everything the sun touches is going to be your kingdom, right? That's this, right? If you see, this is the emperor, this is the bird represented as the leader, the ruler. This is everything in his domain. And even the birds are flocking to worship him, or admire him, or to follow him. So this is a very beautiful painting, very decorative. You can see an earlier influence of ink painting like this, but it becomes more colorful and decorative as well. So very beautiful. Moving to the art in Japan, Buddhism had taken hold in Japan during the 13th century, which we talked about, and you had the earlier Shinto religion, then it becomes Buddhism, then it becomes Zen Buddhism. And one of the ways that Zen art is very different, you think of like Zen gardens, wabi-sabi, like I talked about before in the Art of Faith chapter. One of the things that's really important is like minimal and streamlined, very simplified. So one of these types of ink paintings is called hoboku, and we can see that here. Hoboku means broken ink or broken landscape, and it's really saying a lot with very little. It's like a haiku in a sense. If you think about Zen and just a certain kind of format where you can explore the idea of a landscape, really, really misty, atmospheric landscape, but just as putting as few brushstrokes down as possible and thinning down and diluting the ink. So it's just like, it's barely even there, but it will represent mountains and mists and waterfalls and trees and even a village back here in the back. So really, really beautiful movement called hoboku, broken ink, this landscape from the same era. What's happening in the Western tradition in Europe, this is happening in Japan. The last image that I want to show you comes from Africa. It's really interesting. This is called the era of encounter, where, like, if you think about Marco Polo as like a Westerner going to China and people encountering these new cultures, the same thing happened in Africa when the Portuguese, right, from Europe come to Africa. They were compared to mudfish by the Benin culture, which is in this part of Nigeria. And they described the Portuguese as mudfish because they were both like fish on water, coming in boats, but could also walk on land. They were a little bit lighter, in skin tone, so they compared them to almost like godlike as well because of their ability to, in some ways they were more advanced, but not necessarily. I think that's an oversimplification. They were introducing new things to this African Benin culture. And the Benin traded gold, ivory, and rubber, which for them was very easy to get, for beads and brass that came from, which would have been new to them, right? So here we see, this last image I'm going to show you is a mask of a queen, probably a specific queen, Ija, in the court of Benin in Nigeria, and it's ivory and also has some copper in it, and at the top is those Portuguese mudfish that's depicted here in this crown, which is really, really beautiful. This is a really important artifact as well, and I think it goes to show you what was of importance. This would have been worn by a queen, likely on her hip, and a mask to show status, right? It's a very beautiful piece, and it's depicting the queen herself. This is at the Met Museum. I saw it this summer in New York. Beautiful piece. The Metropolitan Museum in New York, if you've not been, is one of the most important museums in the world, and they have a lot of art from a lot of different cultures throughout the world. So I think, you know, if you look at the gesture here, if you look at the face, the way that it's rendered, it's stylized, but it's also very naturalistic at the same time. I mean, there's stylized ideas of like the crown here that's on the head, but if you look at the lips, the eyes, there's this sort of dramatic pose and lifelike quality. Like if I squint at this thing, right, and suspend disbelief, and even though it's smaller, it's not life size, it's about, you know, this big, it's a little bit smaller than a head. If I suspend disbelief, it's like I'm looking into the eyes of the queen. Really, really interesting depiction here. This is the last of the images that I'm going to show you. I know I talked a little bit longer than I had planned. Like I said, I get excited about all these things. I love it. Hope that you guys can identify and relate to it as well. Remember, read a chapter, take the quiz. Good luck. And I look forward to reading what all of you guys write about these movies that you've been watching and your responses to the art. So, peace out.